for posterity. And yeah, we'll charge through these 6 samples. Hopefully you've all got them. And Jane, well, we've suggested an order to try them in, which I think is probably going to go in the chat function if it hasn't already. Well, if Charlie or Nathan, if you could just pop that in the chat function so people know what order we'll be drinking the wines in. As we're quite a big group, I'd sort of ask maybe keep any longer questions to the end, so those who need to pop off and get dinner, etc., can do so. But having said that, that's a terrible joke, Nathan. Do use the chat function for all your little comments and queries and questions, and we'll feed them into the tasting as we go. Brilliant. Are we recording, Charlie? We are. Good. Perfect. So I'll be very brief because we're very lucky to have Jane with us, and it's far better that she does the talking than I do. But just suffice to say, for those who haven't heard previously, Jane and I met, I think it was back in 2013 or 2014. It must have been 14.
It's been 14 because we drank the Corton.
Exactly. And I was staying with a really good friend of mine, Tom Kevill Davies, out in Ausy de Rest. The Hungry Cyclist has a wonderful place there. Whenever you're next visiting Burgundy, it's a superb place to stop off. Great to stay, great food. He's a wonderful bon vivant, lovely chap, great cyclist, lots of cycling routes around Burgundy, brilliant base. And one evening, Tom said, would you mind if I invite a friend over for dinner? I was like, well, A, it's your house, and B, of course not. And he said, she's a winemaker. So I said, well, this is just perfect. And then Julie sort of tooled up with a half-drunk bottle of her Corton Renard Grand Cru 13, and it was amazing wine. And obviously we got talking, and I was asking Jane, well, what are you sort of doing in the UK? And at the time, not a great deal. And I couldn't believe it that someone called Jane Eyre, making these wonderful Burgundies, was not really sort of widely known and much loved in the UK. So anyway, long story short, we started working with Jane from the 2014 En Primeur vintage onwards, and we've been working very happily ever since. So that's our history with Jane. I'm going to hand over to her now to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about her pretty amazing backstory, and probably introduce the first wine, just so you've got something in your glass to enjoy as we carry on. Over to you, Jane.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks everyone for giving up an hour of your time on a Tuesday. I tend to prattle on a little bit, so please don't necessarily wait for me to talk about each of the wines. I will get to all of them, but feel free to, if you've got 6 glasses in front of you, that's the ideal thing, that that you can smell them and compare them and taste them. But please don't wait for me to start tasting them and start drinking them without boring you all too much. I mean, I'm obviously Australian, not French. I decided I wanted to make wine after doing 10 years of hairdressing, and just was lucky that a client had friends in Burgundy. So I had no idea what I was doing, but decided that I wanted to make wine, and did my first vintage in 98 and absolutely loved it. Went back to Australia and started doing my winemaking degree by correspondence, got a job in a fabulous wine store in Melbourne that specialised in high-end wine. So I got to drink far better then than I do today, because I had to sell other people's, it was a pleasure to sell other people's wines. Kept coming back to Burgundy every year and sort of worked my way around various domains there. The wonderful thing about the wine store in Australia is that we used to do lots of tastings and dinners with lots of great winemakers. So I got to go and work for lots of fabulous people, because after a dinner or a tasting, I'd ask them if I could go and do vintage with them. So I worked at Cullen in Margaret River, and Felton Road, Natarangi in New Zealand. Then when I decided to leave Australia, I went and worked for Ernie Lozen in the Mosel for 3 months. And then the plan was to go back to Burgundy. So it was actually the weekend of the Vent Vivant back in 2003 that came over to Burgundy and went and saw Dominique Lafont, who I'd worked with the previous vintage, and said, look, I've left Australia. I really want to come back to Burgundy. Can you give me a job, or do you know anyone that can give me a job? And he was like, oh, you know, would love to, but the paperwork's really difficult. Or, you know, I'm sorry. So went back to Germany and had planned to go back to Australia when an email came through just before Christmas saying, come for 3 months by, you know, from Dominic's secretary. So someone asked me the other day what my first sort of foray into the vineyards was here, and I remember that I had moved here, and it was January of 2019, and was staying at the domain that I had worked with previously. And so the first day was in the snow in Monteley pruning. The people that I was staying with, they'd gone away for the week, and it was at that moment that the heating went off in the house. So here I was working in the vineyards in the snow, and then going home and having to boil a saucepan of hot water to try and have a shower, well, bath, something warm. And I did think, what have I done? I've left this very cozy job in a nice place in Melbourne where I got to drink great wine, had a good salary, had a view of the beach, and here I am with no heating and working in the snow. But anyway, I stayed and ended up working for Comte Lafon for a year, and then went on to De Monte, and then ended up working for an American, Chris Newman, for 13 years. And then you get to the point when you're working for somebody else that you actually you want to do your own thing. So a good friend, Benjamin LaRue, gave me a shove in 2011 and said, when are you ever going to make your own wine? So that started with my first wine in 2011, which was a Sauvignon Le Beaune Premier Cru Beaujolais. And I didn't have any money. So my boss at the time gifted me a new barrel. A friend in Australia lent me 6,000 euros to get started, and so I started with one wine, 5 barrels. I needed to get out of Ben's place, and Dominic Lafon came to the rescue again, because he has, which you may see in England, his negociant wines, Dominic Lafon. And I just didn't have the money to buy the equipment, or really it didn't make any sense for me to own to try and have my own place with all my own equipment when I didn't have very much wine. So I've been sharing a winery with Dominic ever since. And the business has grown from 1 wine, 5 barrels, to around 20,000 bottles, and 10 different wines. And I'm going to have to throw it in, because it's only ever going to happen once in my life, that the Revue de Vin de France, which is like the Michelin wine guide, I guess, over here, nominated me as the negociant of the year, which I won, which I found out that I'd won last month. So I feel like it's been an incredible journey from hairdressing in Melbourne to starting off in the vineyards here, to sort of being given one of the top awards within the peers and the critics of the wine world over here, which is fairly male dominated and French. So it's been quite an amazing time, and I couldn't have done it without all the support. So with people believing in me, like Honest Grapes, when really I'm an unknown with, not the cheapest wines in the world, from certainly not the cheapest wine region in the world. So it's nice that I've had the support to be able to grow over the years. So just a little thank you to everyone that has bought my wines, importers and customers alike. So that's just a little bit of blab, how I got to where I am today. And I guess this is a little bit of a history tasting here as well. So I started off with the Sauvignon Le Beaune, and then a few people sort of started saying, oh, it'd be really good if you could make an entry-level wine. And in that, they were meaning a Burgundy Rouge, because I predominantly only make reds. In 2016, when the questions had come up, it was a year where we'd had a terrible frost episode at the end of April, and so there really wasn't very much around. So it was going to be a difficult thing to do anyway. And I just sort of thought, well, for a very similar price, I can get a Burgundy Cru or a village wine, or I can get a Cru Beaujolais. So I didn't really have to think about it for very long, and started looking around in Beaujolais for something to make. Fleury really was my, where I started looking, because the flavor profile of Fleury suits the style of wines that I like to make. So I found a grower in a little village called Beaune. And of course, when I started looking at what I wanted in Fleury and sort of tasted lots of other people's wines, the most prestigious Le D in Fleury is Le Madon, which is up on the hill. And I remember the day that we ended up picking the grapes, you have a beautiful view out to Mont Blanc. It's quite high up, so it's actually advantageous in these warmer years as well, because it tends to keep a little bit cooler. So that 2000, and anyway, so when I went and had a look at the vineyards, he said, well, you can have some Le Madon, but he said, just come and have a look at this other vineyard I've got. And I went, okay, well, I really want Le Madon. So he took me around, around the other side of the hill and to this really lovely old vineyard called Rapport. So 80-year-old vines, just really lovely vineyard. And so that the 2016 you've got ended up being 50% Le Madon and 50% Rapport. And in my mind, it was going to be 100% whole bunch, very much, Beaujolais carbonic maceration style. But then when I got the fruit and we started sorting it, I just realized that the Madon was good, but it wasn't perfect. So we ended up de-stemming that portion of it. And the Labron was actually the portion that went in as whole bunch. So it's 50% whole bunch. It spent 3 to 4 weeks on skins, which is long, I guess, for a Beaujolais. And then it aged in older 500-litre barrels and a portion in stainless steel. So it was when it first went to bottle, it was just this really super crunchy, fruity, just very smashable wine. And I'm not sure whether you have the screw, well, you've got little bottles, but I actually just went, and this is the Australian side coming out in me, I just thought, well, the style of the wine, I would really like to put it in screw cap, because it's just all this bright, crunchy fruit, and just sort of screw cap would be good for that wine. And my agent in Paris was like, you can't put it in screw cap. It doesn't matter what the price of it is, but it has to be in cork. Like the clients that we deal with, which is mainly the Michelin restaurants, it has to be cork. And I went, well, okay, Philip, I'll give your allocation in cork and the rest of it's going in screw cap. And anyway, in the end, he sold all the cork and then went, actually, can I have the screw cap? So the moral of that story is I'm never listening to my agent again when he tells me how to put what closure to put my wines in. But you will find with my wines that there are screw caps, there are DMs, which are the composite corks, there are corks, because I think sometimes some closures are better for some wines than they are for others. I still haven't 100% made a decision whether I think that DM is better than cork or cork is better than DM. So I spend as much money as I can on the corks. I get the best that I can, but I still do a portion in DM. So people have the choice, but I still haven't completely made my mind up. Anyway, and then I really had a lot of fun making the Fleury in 16 and really liked the result of that. So I went looking for more Beaujolais in 2017. So that brings us to the Jancis, which is the second wine, 2017. Now, 2017 was a little bit more, complicated in a different way. 16, we had the frost, and then 17, I had gone to see the grower. And as a negotiant, I don't own any of my own vineyards, but what I do try to do is find growers who work really well in the vineyard, so I'm not going to do a better job than they are, and that I can get the fruit from that parcel from those same people every year, so that I get to understand how the grapes react to certain ways of fermenting, or what those characters are in the wine at the end, so that each year I can refine what I do or don't do. And so the idea of the Chenas was, and so I went down to Fleury and had a look around, and everything was looking great. And then I think the next day, Fleury just got hit with a massive hailstorm. And then it got hit again, I think 2 weeks later, and there was literally nothing left in Fleury. Le Madone had been annihilated. But my little parcel of Laberon around the back of the hill didn't get touched. The Chenas had got a little bit of hail on it, but my idea was to make 100% whole bunch, carbonic maceration, something perhaps a little bit lighter on its feet, easier to drink. And anyway, by the time I got the fruit, it had some hail damage on it, because it had been a warm summer. There started to be a little bit of shrivel, so there really wasn't one perfect bunch of grapes. So you know what they say about best laid plans. So the whole 100% whole bunch thing went out the window, and it ended up being 100% destemmed, and ended up spending a month on skins. And then it really was just quite slow to finish its ferment. So it was also supposed to go into 500-litre older barrels, but it ended up staying in stainless steel. So I actually ended up doing all the things I wasn't expecting to do. But you know, that's all part of the fun of it all. But it's ended up being quite a rich, structured wine. Often when people think of Beaujolais, they think of Beaujolais Nouveau. And, you know, Beaujolais Nouveau was a thing that the winemakers sort of bought into to help promote Beaujolais and Gamay, and basically to sell some wine. So the wines were on the tables around the world the third Thursday in November, and my wines are usually still sitting in tank at that point. So people have this image of Beaujolais maybe being a little bit lighter and not age worthy, whereas, you know, Gamay is a wonderful variety that has plenty of aging potential, and can make these quite serious, quite structured wines. So I think the Chenas is a bit of a surprise, because it has got a lot of sort of darker fruit. It's quite rich, but it, you know, it's got a fair bit of tannin structure there. I mean, I actually haven't got them sitting in front of me tonight, so I don't know how they're tasting, the 16 to the 17. So I don't know whether maybe even Tom, if you want to unmute yourself for a moment and make a comment, or Nathan.
I'd say the Fleury is showing a really, really beautifully drinkable. The last time I had the 16 was probably about a year ago, and there it was still sort of coming into drinking. Now it's just gorgeous, and even there's a touch of VA there, but very, very, very tiny bit. It's got a real beautiful complexity. The Chenas 17, as you're saying, much more structured, darker fruit, quite recalcitrant on the nose, maybe through the bottling, I don't know, but in the taste, it's just really that gorgeous dark fruit is just really, really present. And yeah, a complete, not your sort of will-o'-the-wisp Beaujolais Nouveau at all.
No, they certainly aren't. But you know, that's the fun thing about winemaking, and you know, and even with the 17s, they've taken a little while to come around, because when I was tasting at one point the Fleury 17, it was sort of showing a lot more structure than all that pretty fruit that the 16 had. And I actually have had it out with me today in Paris, and it's really come around and opened up and showing some really pretty fruit. So they do need time. They're not these things that you just you know, drink within the first 6 months of their life. And hopefully there's something that maybe might change some people's opinions of you know, the ageability and the potential of Gamay and Beaujolais.
Jane, how long will these two last now? I mean, my own reckoning would be that Fleury is really our point now. Probably it'll keep going. The Chenas, I still feel, is on the way up.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's that thing that because both of these are the first vintages of those wines, I'm learning really with them as to their ageability. But I always thought that they'd be easily 10 years. perhaps longer. So if they're drinking nicely, now that's why it's always nice to buy a dozen wines, dozen bottles of one wine, because and I'm not just trying to up your sales, Nathan, but it just means that you can pull a bottle, you can try it and go, oh, that's nice, now I'll drink a couple, or oh, that's really not ready, so I'll leave it in the cellar, and then you can come back to it a year later, and again, you go, oh, it's still not ready, or it's drinking nicely. And so you can actually follow the evolution and find where you like to drink them, and have the opportunity to leave a couple to go a little bit longer.
Yeah, totally. I think the reputation of Beaujolais has been thoroughly sort of rehabilitated in the last decade or so. And the one's no longer apologetic about them. They're wines to stand up and be proud of. And there's more concentration, there's more richness, there's more everything about the wines, and they're no longer the sort of an alternative to Burgundy. I think they're very much part of the spectrum, in fact. So it's delicious to have such a nice range. Whilst we're moving on now to the next wine, which is the Côte de Nuit Village. I just Jane touched on this earlier in typically modest fashion about the RVF award, and it's a big deal, frankly. The Revue de Vin de France is, I like that equivalent, the Michelin guide for wine, effectively. And Jane also got a second star, so is now a 2-star winery from them back in December. And if you consider that last year's recipient of the Negociant of the Year was Duclos. So Duclos are one of the biggest and oldest and most prestigious Bordeaux negociants. And, so to be sort of the outsider, the underdog, and to be recognized by this very, very well heralded institution is a huge accolade. So I just thought I'd throw that in for good measure. But
thank you, Tom.
Now, Côte de Nuit Village.
It was interesting because one of the restaurants we went to today, Pierre is one of the journalists at the RVF, and he just sort of slipped into the conversation as to whether it had had any impact on business, or had it really changed anything. And he was one of the ones that had pushed for me, and he, and I explained that it basically has changed everything. But
you said, don't speak to me, speak to my secretary.
Exactly. Yeah, you'll have to speak to my allocations officer over there. But oh god, what was my point that I was trying to make? Oh, but that they did. He said, they've had a little bit of backlash because I am small compared to these companies that make millions of bottles of wine. So I guess they have had a little bit of perhaps criticism as to, I'm quite small. But then he was kind of like, well, that's part of the challenge, that she is small and has been able to produce wines that, that people have enjoyed. So anyway, I'm taking it and running with it for the moment. So anyway, on to the Côte de Nuit. This wine I started making in 2014. It comes from 2 parcels in Comblanchien. So when you have a Côte de Nuit village, it's actually allowed to you're allowed to get the grapes from 5 different villages in the Côte de Nuit. But it's just happened that I've always been able to get parcels from Comblanchien. And I think it's an appellation. People don't have high expectations of Côte de Nuit. It tends to fit in, I think, somewhere between a Bourgogne Rouge and a village wine. But I think that there are some seriously good parcels of Côte de Nuit, and I think Comblanchien and Corguin, because they're stuck in a little bit on the way from exiting Corton and Côte de Beaune into the beginnings of the Côte de Nuit, but before you get to Von Romanée and Gevrey and and Von Romanée. So it suffers with a little bit of an image problem, I think, but these are fabulous parcels that I get the wines from. They're 60-year-old vines, and they just produce, I think, this wine that bats well above, certainly above a Côte de Nuit what people expect, and really I think fits into a high-end village wine. The 18, so the 17s, well, my wines up until 17 had pretty much all been 100% de-stemmed, and I always thought that the Côte de Nuit, just the fruit spectrum, would work quite well with using some whole bunch. But again, if the fruit has any damage, whether it's hail or any disease, I just won't put the whole bunch in there. But 18 was great, and it was a warm year. So 17s were the first year in quite some time that we didn't have hail or frost, and actually had a reasonable crop. Still a warm summer, but there was a little bit more of a coolness around harvest time. So the wines tend to be a little bit lighter in colour, a little bit more delicate, if you like. And so I de-stemmed everything in 17. Then we get to 18, and warm year, everything was ripe, quite rich. So I actually upped the whole percent. So I went to 30% whole bunch in this wine. And I've just found over the last couple of years that by using some whole bunch, it helps to add a little bit of complexity to the wine, and also helps maintain a little bit of the freshness in the wine, which helps against maybe these richer, warmer years. So by putting the stalks in, they actually can absorb a little bit of the alcohol as well. So you can reduce the alcohol content by up to about 0.5%, which is helpful when the grapes are quite ripe. But it just gives an added complexity, some different flavors to the wine. Also, this wine's going more and more into larger format. So standard barrels here are 228 litres. Now each time I buy a new barrel, it's going into 300-litre barrels. And again, it's got really nice fruit flavors to it, but it has got quite a core of sort of denser, darker fruit. It's quite rich, but the tannins are still always quite soft, I think, on the Côte de Nuit.
And Jane, would you say that with this spate of warm, very solar vintages, 18, 19, 20 specifically, you're doing progressively more whole bunch, and are you using progressively bigger barrels and more or less new oak? How's that sort of all working out?
Well, it's interesting because you buy new barrels because you have to replace the old ones. I've never been a fan of over-oaked wines, because I think that it should be something that complements the wine, maybe helps to add some complexity. It shouldn't overrun it. And because I tend to let the wines pretty much ferment themselves, so I don't look for much extraction, because I think it's all there. If you get good grapes that are well grown, they're all there, and it's all in balance. So it's just the Côte de Nuit with its fruit profile. I always just thought it'd be better in larger formats. So that's only for that wine rather than any of the other wines. It only has 10% new oak, this wine. But you find, what I notice in some of these warmer years, that when you taste the wines that are in the new barrel, actually can give a little bit of freshness to the wine. So it's interesting what they will give to the wines in different years. So you can get away with using more new oak in a warmer year, but also too because the wines are much more richer. They absorb the oak more than if you're in a cooler year, where the wines are perhaps a little bit more transparent. The percentage of oak stands out a lot more. So I think you can get away with using more in warmer years, and it can be helpful, but it's more as a support. It should never be something that dominates the wine. So the whole bunch is definitely helping, and I'm doing more and more of that with these warmer years. And I think it helps to keep the wines a little bit fresher. So moving into the next wine, Clavier. So this was a wine that actually it's the only year I made it. I got the fruit from the same grower that I get my Beaune Premier Cru Sanvin from, and this is a beautiful parcel. So Santenay, again, it's an appellation that maybe has a little bit of an image, not an image problem, I don't want to say that, but it's sort of down, down the, getting towards the end of the Côte de Beaune. Centenay and the Morange can have a tendency to have quite rustic tannins. But again, it depends on how people vinify their wines as to maybe how how much extraction you get as to how tannic the wines can be. But Clavier is said to be the Chambol of the Côte de Beaune, because apparently the soil profile that is in Chambol goes down and pops its head up again around Centenay. And Le Clavier is one of the most prestigious parcels in Centenay. And it's quite good in warmer years again, because it's just below, there's a windmill up on the hill for those of you that have spent any time in Burgundy. And because there's almost a little bit of a cliff face there, if you like, it actually helps to protect and keep the vineyard a little bit cooler. These vines are between 70 and 80 years old. The domain, when I was buying the fruit, was certified organic, so working organically and biodynamically. And again, I had this idea of perhaps a slightly gentler wine, and again, it's quite a rich wine. Again, it's got 30% whole bunch in there. There were 4 barrels, so 1 new, so 25%, so a little bit more than the previous wine. But I don't think that the new oak stands out. I think it's very well absorbed by the wine. But getting into these 18s now, they're they're starting to show themselves a little bit, but I think they still really need, especially this wine and the next wine, probably would be good to stick away in the cellar for another couple of years.
And Jane, a couple of questions just sprung to mind as you were talking. Firstly, Laurent Delaunay, who we do quite a lot of work with. I remember him mentioning in November that he said Centenay Premier Cru is the best value Premier Cru in Burgundy. It's sort of like the point at which it's worth getting a Premier Cru, but it's the jumping off point, and it is. And I remember even nearly 20 years ago, when you found a good Centenay Premier Cru, then it was fill up the trucks, because it's so good, it's worth having because it will last. You said you're not unfortunately, you don't currently have the contract with this particular grower. Are you looking out for another Centenay Premier Cru?
Yeah, I would love to find one. I mean, when I start doing something, it's because I have an interest in that appellation. And then I try and find a grower who's got some fruit who also works well in the vineyards. So I didn't get any sort of after that, because their crops were smaller in 19 and now the domain's been sold. But absolutely, if I could find another parcel of Gravier or a good Centenay, I would very happily go back and keep making it, because like you say, it's it's good value. If you can still say that in Burgundy in the same sentence. And it's interesting when you talk about what people's perceptions are and what the characteristics are of particular appellations. So I always think Beaune and Pommard are classics, because they say Pommards a bit more earthy, can be quite tannic, whereas Beaune tends to be, the prettier, more perfumed, Aryan styles, if you like. But then if you compare a Typier or maybe a Rougien from Pommard and a Champon from Beaune, you'd actually think, given those descriptors, that they're actually the other way around. And then if you look at, again, Centenay, a lot of it has been perhaps who's been making the wines and how they've been made, that they perhaps were a bit more rustic, if you like. And if you refine what you do to them and not maybe get too much extraction, you can end up having these really elegant, really beautiful perfumed wines that are also a better value for money.
And I think one thing we've definitely seen with 18 and certainly perhaps even more so 19, and it'll be interesting to see with 20, is that the slightly sort of under the radar appellations seem to have overperformed. They have, I think you mentioned earlier, they've really benefited from being brought into the light, quite literally. That extra sun has given them a ripeness and a plushness, perhaps, which is making them really attractive. So I think now is the time for these appellations to really come into the forefront, which is great, because as you say, you know, as you know, if there is value in Burgundy, then it is places like Santenay and Marsanay, for example, where you're beginning to find it. So that's a good thing.
No, and I mean, that's the thing, that you go up the hill and round the corner, and things like Haute Côte that have been quite marginal in years gone by. So make a lighter wine that doesn't necessarily have, you know, maybe a short-term aging potential, that they're actually getting riper. There are some really great soil profiles, and suddenly people are like, wow, there's some really good wines to be had up here. And if you look at the lay of the land, I mean, the Grand Cru vineyards, all the best vineyards are east facing, middle of the slope, so get good sun exposure, good drainage, and the lesser vineyards are maybe the ones that are in shadow for longer, so the fruit just doesn't get as ripe. Now we're in years where everything gets ripe, and so those vineyards that traditionally maybe didn't produce a you know, so produced entry-level wine, if you like, just purely because they maybe lacked that little bit extra ripeness, they're getting that ripeness now, and so they're like, bang, you know, the quality has gone up.
Totally.
So,
and whilst we move on now to really quite a special wine, the Chassagne, I believe. Again, something you mentioned, which I think is probably worth unpacking for some people on joining us this evening. We're talking about how well the 18s are drinking now, or not, of course. But we've tended to find that your wines are quite accessible quite early on. You know, you bottle relatively early, we ship pretty early, we drink. That's not to say that they won't age, but are you finding with your wines now that they are closing down after a period? You know, the primary fruit kind of closes and then they open, or do they just remain fairly sort of open for the period?
I think it depends on, and I mean, it's true. I didn't. It seems to be the trend these days to make lighter, perhaps more accessible wines. That's, you know, a shift in trends, which also follow through in restaurants as well. Just the type of food that people are eating in restaurants are getting a little bit lighter. People often start out with you know, bigger, richer wines like Cabernets, Bordeaux, and then you find that they often end up shifting to Pinot and to Burgundy later on. And I love Pinot because it's an aromatic variety. So my objective has never been to extract lots of tannins and try and make a big, rich wine. If that's what you want, drink something else, you know, drink a Châteauneuf de Pape, or go further south where the grapes are naturally more tannic and richer and bigger. So almost by default, my wines probably have been approachable earlier on, because I'm not looking to extract the life out of them during the vinification or putting them in 100% new oak. So they have been approachable early on, but I don't think that it means that, okay, I wouldn't want to maybe pull some of these out in 30 years. And some other ways of making wine almost make them undrinkable when they're young, and you really have to wait a long time for them to come around. But this next wine, for example, I mean, it's nice now because it has got that lovely primary fruit, but it really needs to be left alone, I think, for 10 years to develop it. And that's the thing, you can enjoy these wines when they're young, but you don't get the full potential and the interest of the wine like a Grand Cru or a Premier Cru, or even the village wines. But by leaving them and letting them age, you get some more of those savory flavors, you get some more complexity, so you actually get more out of the wine later on, even though they can still be enjoyed younger. But it does depend. I mean, if you look at that Chenas, you know, it's really, I think, starting to shine now. And as one of you said before, that it's still got a way to go, whereas, you know, the Fleury 16, you can probably enjoy it now. I remember when I had some sommeliers from Paris come and taste the 14s in barrel. And it's someone who's gone back to buying my wines, but he'd had an order. We tasted in the style of the 14s in barrel. And after the tasting, he actually cancelled the order. And it was true, the wines just tasted, everything was just awful. And for those of you who do go and taste in cellars, especially in February or January when it's quite cold, and there are just days when they're not giving anything, even in bottle, if we go to talk about, fruit, flower, root, and leaf days, that often when wines really are singing and quite aromatic are days that tend to be flower and fruit days. And if they tend to be a little bit closed, maybe a little bit more reserved, they do fall on these other days. That, don't ask me to explain it, but there is definitely something in it. But the 14s, for example, when they first went into bottle, they weren't these pretty fruit-driven wines. They showed the structure and perhaps, the difficulty of the year that there'd been hail. And it really wasn't until a couple of years later in bottle that the primary fruit actually started to come out. So they almost did the reverse thing. They sort of had all this structure and weren't very fruity in the beginning. And a couple of years later, all that fruit popped up. So it depends on the nature of and the characteristics, I think, of each vintage. But with them being warmer years now, it does make them a little bit easier to drink. But that being said, I mean, the Bondu that we've got here, the Chassagne, I mean, it's quite a serious wine quite early on. And again, I love Chassagne Red. And I've been looking for one for quite some time. And, I do like to go against the grain a little bit because everyone wants white from, from Chassagne Montrachet, when traditionally it's more of a red appellation than it is a white. I think in the 60s, 60 to 70% of the vineyards in Chassagne were Pinot. And today that percentage is reversed. But so this vineyard I got offered, it's actually in the middle. Le Bondu is a vineyard that is Premier Cru Chardonnay, and in the middle of all this Chardonnay is this little island of 90-year-old Pinot Noir vines that I was lucky enough to get all of it. So this 18, I'm the only one that made a Bondu Premier Cru Pinot Noir. And, again, I was thinking it'd be something a little bit lighter, but I think the age of the vines, the fact that the yield is quite small because they're quite old, means that they just have so much concentration. So this wine actually has nearly 40% whole bunch, but rather than just putting the whole bunch with all the stalk in it, we actually spent a little bit more time and cut out the main part of the stalk. So you're just left with the little bits that, attach to the main one. So you get all the benefits of whole bunch, but you're actually taking some of the green part out, because the people that tell you that you wait until the stalks are ripe, the stalks are never ripe. They are always the fluorescent green, even if you've got shriveled up dried berries hanging off your vine in November. Where it's attached to the vine, that starts to lignify and go brown. But that central bit of the stalk is always green. So by taking that out, you just take out some of the vegetal characters while getting the benefit of still having some stalks in there and the whole bunch in there. So this has always been a very different wine to any of the others. It's more blueberries and blackberries and darker fruit with a little bit of spice in there, and does have this this density to it, but also has a real energy. I don't know whether it's because it's farmed biodynamically, but it's a surprise package. The Chassagne. There's only 3 barrels in 18 and in 19. There's a third new oak in there, but I think sometimes people screw up their nose about Chassagne Red. It's going to be a little bit light, and that really is anything but. And it's also cheaper to buy Pinot from Chassagne Montrachet than it is to buy Chardonnay, and for me, it's actually more interesting. So I hope
Jane,
you all like it.
Jane, when we tasted this at yours, I can't remember when, must have been November 19, wasn't it? It was an absolute revelation. I've always been a big collector of curios, and, you know, in Britain, we're just not used to having red Chassagne Montrachet. And I remember when I first got into Burgundy in my 20s, picking some up, and it tasted like ocean spray cranberry juice. It was, you know, it was that sort of dilute cherry red, you know, obvious class behind it, but not something you'd have a patch on against white Chassagne Montrachet. And then tasting this at yours, it's somber, it's profound, it's spicy, it's like your mini monopole almost. And it is absolutely a pleasure. I stuck a dozen of these in my own cellar last year, so not letting go of any of it. Nice to get a bit now. Jane, I wanted to ask a question about the evolution of your winemaking. By the way, I hope everybody else is enjoying this Chassagne Montrachet Bondu. Please put notes in the chat. But I wanted to ask a question about the evolution of your winemaking, because when Tom and I go around, obviously spending time in Burgundy, tasting what everybody's made, you clearly get the impact of winemakers and thinkers. You also get, obviously, the impact of the vintage, but with you there's clearly an evolution of your learning and your experimentation as well, and your you know, to some extent I'd say your style changed in 18, not just the vintage. So how would you think yourself about the changes in your style evolution on top of the vintage variation, if you see what I mean?
I think that you and just to go back to the Chassagne for a moment, that the reference that I had when I went into it was I'd had a really lovely 2015 Villy Chassagne Montrachet from Ramenais, which I thought was just delicious, very crunchy, very smashable. And I thought, oh, you know, I'd really like to make something like that. And a bit like the Chenas, when you vinify something for the first time, you have an idea of what you hope it might be, and the expectation you have from the other wines you've had from that appellation, from other producers, obviously. If I can, I always try and get bottles from people who have perhaps made that wine from those parcels in the past, just to get a handle on what that fruit might give you. But the first time you go in, when you're fermenting something, you don't really know what it's going to give you. And that's why it's really important for me when I start with someone that I can get those grapes from that parcel, from that grower each year, so that I can start building up my reference points, going, okay, it gave me this last year, and I used a little bit of whole bunch the following year because of, you know, to try and help counteract maybe some of the richness of the warmer years, and this is what that gave me, and I really like that. So next year I might put some more whole bunch in because I think that really worked really well, or excuse me, or didn't love it so much, excuse me, I'll use a little bit less. So you evolve just by having the experience with the vineyards each year, because you go in a little bit blind the first time that you do make wines from a particular vintage. So you learn every year. I mean, I've done 40 plus vintages over 20 years. I've worked with some amazing people.
You don't look that old, Jane.
Oh, thank you. It's the lighting. 2 vintages a year, Nathan. But you learn every year, and every year the climate's different, and something's a little bit different, and so you hope that you just start building up a toolkit and reference points to go, okay, this fruit tastes like this growing season's been like this, this is what I've done in the past, what will I do this year, and just hopefully you just have the experience that you've had from the years previously helps with the decision that you're going to get each year. So and to point with the Bondu, I was sort of wanting originally something that was perhaps a little bit lighter on its feet, and you learn as a winemaker that you can put whole bunch in, you can ferment in stainless steel or in oak, you can do it at certain temperatures, you can do pump overs or punch downs, and there's lots of little things that you can do. And once a wine's been pressed and it first goes into barrel after the alcoholic fermentation, you really see, I think, your winemaking and what you've done, but the vintage and the vineyard will trump you. So a year later, you will see so much more than what you've done to it. The characteristics of the growing season and the natural characteristics of that particular vineyard. So you either accept it and work with it. If you're going to fight with the natural characteristics of that vineyard, I think you should go and make another, you should look for something else. So yeah. It's just, I think it's constant evolution and hopefully learning and evolving.
Yeah. Jasper is an absolutely delight. It really is. Very surprising wine.
Thank you.
I'm blown away by it. Absolutely stunning. Really is.
Good. Well, it's made to be drunk and enjoyed. I mean, at the end of the day, that's that's the idea behind the whole thing. So I guess moving on from there and going back to something a little bit older, going back to 16. This is sort of fairly typical of how Burgundy works. Is the fruit that I get from the Chassagne is a grower that I first met when I moved to Burgundy. So I've known the family for 20 years, so it was never a problem to buy grapes. And in 2012, when I started looking for some Gevrey Chambertin, the grower who had potentially some fruit wouldn't sell me any grapes. So in 2012, I got 2 barrels of Gevrey Village that the grower had vinified, and then I went and picked up the barrels and then I picked up the wine and put them in my barrels in the cellar and did the aging and the bottling. And he obviously liked me. I paid my bills on time. And so in 2013, he sold me the grapes. And then in 2015, a contract came up with some of his fruit for the Gevrey Chambertin Premier Cru, Le Corbeau, which sits right next to Maisy Chambertin. So, it's also not always just a question of how deep your pockets are and how much money you've got. You've got to build a rapport with your growers, and if they like you enough and they like what you do with their grapes and you pay them on time, then you can actually start getting some better grapes and more grapes, and perhaps grapes from different appellations that they have. So the Gevrey 16, again, a year that goes back to very bad frost. Gevrey wasn't hit quite so badly as what some of the other appellations were in the Côte de Beaune was definitely worse hit than the Côte de Nuits. This comes from 2 really lovely parcels up on the hill. And again, Gevrey Chambertin's quite a large appellation, and you've got village vineyards that are situated up on the hill and also that go down over the national down onto the plain. Now, as a negociant, I pay the same price for village grapes down on the hill than I do really nicely situated up on, down on the flat, situated up on the hill. So this wine comes from 2 parcels that are up on the hill. One is just opposite the old chateau, which is just above Arnaud Morte's new winery, if anyone knows where that is. So I get that in its entirety, which normally gives me anything from sort of 2 to 3 barrels. And then we go over a little bit further north to another vineyard called Enchant. And there I get the remainder, 2, 3, 4 barrels worth of grapes that then I take back to the winery and vinify. So, the grower of the Gevrey Village and the Corbeau always likes to say that his village vineyards touch Premier Crus and the Premier Cru touches the Grand Cru, which is very true. So, that they really are very, very good quality vineyards. The 16 was 4 barrels. The new barrel that I use for the Gevreys is a Canus. What's actually happened over the years is that I've just found that certain coopers and the characteristics that you get from the way they toast their barrels and where they get their wood blends well with the appellations that I work with. So, for example, the Savigny Le Beaune, I use a Chassin barrel. The Gevrey Chambertin, I use a Cadus barrel, because it tends to give a little bit of underlying minerality to otherwise something that really has this really quite nice cherry fruit. So 16s overall tend to have a concentration to them because it just wasn't a lot of crop left after the frost. This is 100% destemmed. And I think the 16's probably just starting to open up now. I think they were also quite closed when they were first released, but hopefully they're, it's starting to show quite nicely at the moment, and should have some good aromatics, maybe a little bit of spice starting to come through. But the tannins in the Gevrey too are always quite silky and quite smooth. I really wish I had them all here with me. I wasn't that organised when I came to Paris yesterday.
It's a little bit. It's also a little bit challenging getting the samples out of the UK to continental Europe or Europe, as it's now known, of course.
Yes, yes.
So
you're that island that doesn't belong anymore. A bit like Australia.
But no, thank you, Jane. I mean, a really fabulous lineup of wines, and there's so many that we could have chosen from you that we'd like to have tasted. And I think hopefully those who are joining us this evening, will agree that this is a pretty by no means comprehensive, but a pretty interesting trawl through different vineyards, a few different vintages, and different wines of Jane's. So thank you, first of all, Jane. Very, very kind of you to join us and to show off these wines. It's a great pleasure, working with you and having them to be able to offer. We had a lot of fun last year with a crowd-funded barrel of Chambertin, which again, Nathan and I, when we were out tasting the 18s, Jane, I remember you beckoned us over and said, "Look, we've got something here," and it was in the sort of the darkest, corners of the cellar. Was
right down the back,
right down the back, and we tried this 19 Charm, and we had a really fun opportunity to effectively offer shares in the barrel to in fact there's a good, I was gonna say, Graham, hello over there, and Clive down there. There's a fair few people here who took a share of the barrel. So you probably you won't have tasted the wine yet because we haven't shipped it yet, but it's tasting better than ever. I can certainly account for that when we tried it again in November. And obviously we're very keen if you have any more opportunities like that. I'm sure we've got an appetite amongst some people here and other of our club members and stuff to help out and to get involved. So please do keep us in the loop on that.
And I guess just on that note too, and I know we've covered it before, but I don't know sort of if the people who did buy it realize just how much help actually doing that was, because when I had to come back from Australia in a hurry last year and the end of vintage because all the flights are being cancelled because of COVID, and I got back at the end of March and had no restaurant sales, and all my importers had put everything on hold because no one knew what was happening, and I was in a real panic as to how I was going to come up with the money to pay my growers and just to pay my financial obligations. And so it really was, after speaking to Tom and Nathan and choosing the most expensive wine I had in the cellar at perhaps quite a sensitive time, because people weren't working, people had lost their jobs, people had lost lots of money in various places they had invested. So I did have that moment of like, is it an insensitive thing to offer an expensive wine and ask people to pay for it up front in a fairly delicate moment? And it basically, pardon my French, and I'm going to be very Australian, but it did get me out of the shit. But it just meant that I could pay some very pressing bills that I wasn't sure what I was going to do otherwise. So for all of you sitting in that did buy it, thank you, because it was very helpful, and I hope that you enjoy the wines when you actually get them into your cellars.
Brilliant. Oh, definitely people will, for sure. Well, Jane, thank you so much. That's brilliant. Look, we've run almost exactly to time. Anyone would think we'd rehearse
Never
this.
done that before.
It's great. Thank you very much, Jane, obviously, for your time and for your wines. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're in no absolute tearing hurry to disappear off, but obviously those of you who need to disappear off now, then please, off you go. Thank you very much indeed. Do support us, support Jane's wines. I know there've been various links to what we have available at Honest Grapes. You know, please do check those out. We have a few bits and pieces left. We're sold out of an awful lot, I'm glad to say. And if you've you know, but other comments or queries or questions for Jane or ourselves, then please do stay on for a bit, and I'm sure we'll do our best to keep you entertained for another 10 minutes or so. But thanks very much indeed, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Honest Grapes, for hosting and organising it and getting the wines out to everybody.
Jane, we're going to send an email around to everybody who's participated tomorrow with the back vintages list, but I've included the link on the chat here, but we'll send a link to everybody so you can see them. And I think we're picking them up on Thursday. So
yes,
they should be over in the UK in a few weeks' time.
They're all boxed, they're ready to go. So you'll have them shortly.
Yeah, so basically, to explain to anybody who's not already a club member, the sommelier selection wines are available by the bottle and by the case. They're immediately available in Clapham. So we have quite a nice little range of, you know, bottles and cases there. The club offer we are picking up from Jane on Thursday, and thank you to everybody who's participated in that. And we've added some extra cases to that. So there's still some more. So that's that link. And then 2019s, we've got very, very little left. And we're, you know, if you want the 19s, now's the time, because Jane won't let us have any more. She's really mean.
Boy, oh boy, do I wish I had more to give you, Nathan.
Fame's gone to your head, but anyway.
Oh, it has.
But the wine just
still talking to you.
But the wine, you know, just gets better and better. And I think for all of us, Jane, the way in which the wines stylistically the wines have evolved, but actually one lovely feature of them is they just drink when you ship them to us. They are forward wines. They're very pleasant to drink. But having this evening, being able to taste them back a bit to 16s is really lovely, because there's so little of that around now.
No, and that's the thing. And you know, it's one of the unfortunate parts of my business is that you know, cash flow is always an interesting issue when you're a negotiator or being in the wine industry, regardless of what side you're on. But it just means that you do have to sell things when, you know, in an ideal world, you know, I would sit on them until they are ready to drink, so that people could either then put them in their cellars, or, you know, they can drink them. And not everyone has cellars or cellar space, so the fact that they maybe are a little bit more approachable and easier to drink when they're young, so much the better, because again, as I said, they're you know, it's meant to be enjoyed. The wine's meant to be shared. It's meant to be had with a meal, and that, you know, that really is, that's the crux of it, really.
Yeah, indeed, totally. Again, thank you so much, Jane. Wonderful to see you, and fantastic to have these wines. It's super exciting. Looking forward to coming out to Burgundy at some point. Not quite sure when, but hopefully at some point this year. We do have another tasting this week with Roman Topinot from Domaine Topinot Merm on Thursday. So I know there's a few people here for sure who are joining. If you are at a loose end on Thursday, or even if you're not, cancel your plans, because it'll be pretty exciting to come and be joined by Roman, who's another good friend, another great winemaker, and also very forthright about the qualities or not of Burgundy and the vintage. So please do have a look if you're free and join us for that. We've got various other fun Burgundy bits and pieces going on. We're coming to the end of a really successful On Premier campaign. It's great, the enthusiasm which the 2019 vintage has been greeted. So do get in touch. Do come for more tastings. We've got plenty coming up. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Jane. Absolute pleasure. Lovely to see you. Congratulations again for everything. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you again for another wine therapy session in the none too distant future. Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Cheers.